Welcome to Picturesque Multimedia's presentation on Latinos in World War II, honoring their service and understanding the challenges they faced. Turning then to our first slide, you see heroic examples, Cleto L. Rodriguez and Jose M. Lopez, and the guiding question, which is how do these two Congressional Medal of Honor winners serve as a lens through which to view broader trends in Latino wartime service? Turning then to the second slide, above the call of duty, you can see that the percent of Mexican Americans who served in World War II was higher than the overall percent of Mexican Americans in the general population. So Latinos are serving at a higher rate. Also, Latinos are the most decorated of any ethnic group, as we already mentioned. And the example of these two Congressional Medal of Honor winners can show broader trends within military service. Are, for example, Latinos more willing to die for their fellow soldiers? Is there something particular about the culture that leads to more heroism in the face of adversity? Another thing to understand with that high rate of Latino participation in the war is that you see the readiness on the part of the population to serve and to die for country. And yet you have to understand it within the context where there was, right before World War II, there was the repatriation of an estimated 2 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans, about 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens. So repatriation, again, is a nice term for the forced or involuntary migration of many Mexican Americans who were scapegoated for the economic hardship going on in the 1930s. Another point that should be made in way of context is that the Bracero program, arranged by the U.S. and Mexican government and begun in 1942, was already underway and recruiting initially agricultural contract laborers to come and fill a labor shortage caused by the war. So what makes the disproportionately high rate of Latino service, the high patriotism, the willingness to serve one's country and die for one's country remarkable is not only the history in the 1930s of Mexican-American repatriation, the decade of betrayal, as historians Francisco Valderrama and Raymond Rodriguez have called it, but also the mistreatment of these contract laborers under the Bracero program. With all of that in mind, in way of context, let's turn to look at the service of Cleto Rodriguez and Jose Lopez. You can see from Cleto Rodriguez's biographical details that it may be a fairly similar story or a fairly common story. And so again, if we look at these two individuals as representative of broader trends in Latino wartime service, we should be thinking about what are the commonalities as well as the differences between their stories and other Latino stories. Cleto grew up in San Marcos, Texas, and moved to San Antonio at age 9 when he was orphaned. He entered the U.S. Army as a technical sergeant in 1942. He married Flora Muñez on November 11th, 1945, and they had 4 children over the course of their marriage. He served as an automatic rifleman with Company B, 148th Infantry in the Philippines. After the war, he joined the League of Latin American Citizens, LULAC, Council 2, in 1946. He served as a representative for the Veterans Administration in 1947. And he re-enlisted serving in the United States Air Force from 1952 to 1954, and in the Army from 1955 to 1970. Let's look now at the War Department citation for his Congressional Medal of Honor. It reads, "He was an automatic rifleman when his unit attacked the strongly defended Paco Railroad Station during the Battle for Manila, Philippine Islands. While making a frontal assault across an open field, his platoon was halted 100 yards from the station by intense enemy fire. On his own initiative, he left the platoon, accompanied by a comrade, and continued forward to a house 60 yards from the objective. Although under constant enemy observation, the 2 men remained in this position for an hour, firing at targets of opportunity, killing more than 35 hostile soldiers and wounding many more. Moving closer to the station and discovering a group of Japanese replacements attempting to reach pillboxes, they opened heavy fire, killed more than 40, and stopped all subsequent attempts to man the emplacements. Enemy fire became more intense as they advanced to within 20 yards of the station. On the next slide, you see a map of Manila showing the different groupings of soldiers and the different lines of resistance. The War Department citation continues as follows. Then, covered by his companion, Private Rodriguez boldly moved up to the building and threw 5 grenades through a doorway, killing 7 Japanese, destroying a 20mm gun and wrecking a heavy machine gun. With their ammunition running low, the 2 men started to return to the American lines, alternatively providing covering fire for each other's withdrawal. During this movement, Private Rodriguez's companion was killed. In 2.5 hours of fierce fighting, the intrepid team had killed more than 82 Japanese, completely disorganizing their defense, and paved the way for the subsequent overwhelming defeat of the enemy at this strong point. The War Department citation then continues, and you can see a picture of the Paco Railroad Station at Manila as follows. 2 days later, Private Rodriguez again enabled his comrades to advance when he single-handedly killed 6 Japanese and destroyed a well-placed 22mm gun. By his outstanding skill with his weapons, gallant determination to destroy the enemy, and heroic courage in the face of tremendous odds, Private Rodriguez on 2 occasions materially aided the advance of our troops in Manila. All of his various military accolades, which include Medal of Honor, Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, Purple Heart, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 2 Bronze Service Stars, Philippine Liberation Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. And the words to describe these individuals are particularly telling, not just of their particular actions to win the Congressional Medal of Honor, but also of a kind of distinct character of courage, of service, and of sacrifice. The quotes are things like gallant determination to destroy the enemy, heroic courage in the face of tremendous odds, gallantry and intrepidity on seemingly suicidal missions in which he killed at least 100 of the enemy, were almost solely responsible for allowing Company K to avoid being enveloped. These are serious words coming from the official government records. If you turn to the next slide, you'll see the biographical information for Jose Lopez. And you should think about the context, right? And also the ways in which his story may be representative or may not be representative of a broader Latino experience. Jose Lopez was born in Mexico and was orphaned at the age of 8 and worked in the cotton fields near Brownsville, Texas to support himself. He married Amelia Herrera Lopez and they had 5 children over the course of their marriage. He had a 7-year career as a lightweight boxer, a very good one for that matter, 52 wins, 3 losses, never being knocked down. He enlisted during World War II and landed in Normandy on June 7, 1944. After World War II, like Cleto Rodriguez, Lopez remained in the army and fought in Korea until a superior officer learned that a Medal of Honor recipient was in combat and demanded that he return home or be moved to safer station. He had 19 grandchildren and 10 great-grandchildren. Here you can see the Department of War citation, a picture of him as an older man wearing his Congressional Medal of Honor proudly. The Department of War citation, and it reads as follows. On his own initiative, he carried his heavy machine gun from Company K's right flank to its left in order to protect that flank, which was in danger of being overrun by advancing enemy infantry supported by tanks. Ignoring the enemy fire from an advancing tank, he held his position and cut down 25 more enemy infantry attempting to turn his flank. Glancing to his right, he saw a large number of infantry swarming in from the front. Although dazed and shaken from enemy artillery fire that had crashed to the ground only a few yards away, he realized that his position soon would be outflanked. Take a second here, before we continue the War Department citation, to look at the map. You can see Kryn Kelt and other areas near the Battle of the Bulge. And the War Department citation continues as follows. Again, alone, he carried his machine gun to a position to the right rear of the sector. Enemy tanks and infantry were forcing a withdrawal. Blown over backward by the concussion of enemy fire, he immediately reset his machine gun and continued his fire. Single-handed, he held off the German horde until he was satisfied his company had effected its retirement. Again, he loaded his gun on his back, and in the hail of small arms fire, he ran to a point where a few of his comrades were attempting to set up another defense against the onrushing enemy. He fired from his position until his ammunition was exhausted. Still carrying his gun, he fell back with his small group to Kryn Kelt. The Department of War citation concludes, Sergeant Lopez's gallantry and intrepidity on seemingly suicidal missions in which he killed at least 100 of the enemy were almost solely responsible for allowing Company K to avoid being enveloped, to withdraw successfully, and to give other forces coming up in support time to build a line which repelled the enemy drive. We turn now to the second section on commemorating our heroes, and the focus question is, how can we properly recognize and commemorate Latino war veterans? We can usefully begin with the now very well-known example of Felix Longoria. The background to this issue is that after his remains were discovered in the Philippines and sent back home to be buried in the Three Rivers Cemetery in Texas, in the Mexican section of the cemetery, which was separated off by barbed wire, the funeral director would not allow the chapel to be used because of alleged prior disturbances at Mexican-American funerals, and because, as he said, the whites would not like it. This example of discrimination against Mexican-American soldiers and veterans turned out to be a successful case for the then newly formed American GI Forum in the early struggle for civil rights. Private Longoria eventually was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, but it highlights issues that Latino war veterans faced in being properly recognized for their service and being commemorated for their heroic acts, commemorating our heroes. You see an example, it hasn't been all bad, right? We see here an example where San Antonio officials actually give Cleto Rodriguez a key to the city upon his return from World War II. His old elementary school was renamed after him. A stretch of the 90 was also renamed after him. And he was also included in cultural productions like murals in his local hometown. Now we should remember that in many ways Cleto Rodriguez is unique in getting this kind of respect and commemoration when you see a systematic denial of proper recognition of Latino war veterans, whether intentional or unintentional. They're left out of mainstream accounts of military history, documentaries about World War II. They're either marginalized or completely absent. There are other ways to commemorate the service of heroes, and the ones that we're looking at right now are official recognition, like memorials and statues, naming things after these heroes and whatnot. But in many ways, you can commemorate the history of someone's service in an oral narrative. So if you turn to the next slide, you'll see Jose Lopez, his commemoration operates in a slightly different way because they've done an oral history capturing his story for generations to come. This comes from the University of Texas's oral history project. And if you see, there are some highlights from that oral narrative. What's so nice about these oral narratives is that they capture the stories that are so often told concretely for generations to come. And we see here some of his own thoughts and feelings from the time itself, and we also see him reflecting back on the experience. If you turn then to the next slide, you'll see pictures of him in old age when the interview was actually taken, in this case with the President of the United States. And you see other highlights from his service. And you can see there at the bottom, he's listed among the military legends on military.com. But the issue is, again, is of broader inclusion in mainstream commemoration of World War II veterans, right? Not just Latinos, but veterans in general. Turning then to the next slide, you see that although he never had the opportunity to attend school, he puts this tremendous importance on education. So as a way to commemorate veterans, oral histories, preserving oral narratives and going to those sources and reading their stories is in some ways an incredible commemoration. Let's turn now to the third section of the presentation, which is on understanding the challenges Latino war veterans face. The question guiding this section is, what are the issues of particular concern to Latino and other minority groups? Looking first at the transition back to society of our two representative figures, you can see that both Cleto and Jose continued their service to their community and their country when they returned home, which fits with the research on increased political participation of Latino war veterans. Both served as representatives for the VA, and Cleto served as a representative for LULAC. Both also served in war after returning from World War II, re-enlisting. And one of the questions that you want to examine is that although this is certainly noble, why could they not get out of this mode of sacrificing for other people, serving their community, right? For some people, that certainly is their life's calling. For other people, the question might be, what are the problems in transitioning back into civil society, into civilian life? You see on the next slide, political participation and advocacy. There's a lot of research to support this. Various studies show increased participation on the part of Latino war veterans compared not only to Latino non-war veterans, to the Latino population generally, but also to veterans of other ethnic groups. So Latinos are also more likely to engage in political activities such as signing a petition, donating money, wearing a button, attending a rally. All of those things are considered political activities when you're doing studies of these kinds of things, but most significantly, much more likely to vote in presidential, congressional, and local school board elections, not only than other non-veteran Latinos, but also than other white veterans. So some of the questions are, is it the experience that encourages increased political participation? Are these people more patriotic to begin with? The people more likely to serve their country in war perhaps are more likely to become involved in politics anyway. But these kind of things, the studies, raise a lot of questions that you'll be discussing at the end of this lesson. You see on the next slide, also about increased political participation, that Latinos have long employed self-help economic strategies, beginning with organizations such as the American GI Forum. And these veterans organizations continue to be a resource for veterans facing post-war economic challenges. So this is not just a thing of the past, right? Most recently, using the statistics on how PTSD, unemployment, and homelessness disproportionately affect Latino and other minority veterans, leaders of the Hispanic veterans organizations have demanded, and continue to demand right now, better benefits from the VA, for example. But if you turn to the next slide, you'll see they're up against tremendous odds. The post-World War II government assistance programs, and there's a lot of research to support this, this is an example of institutional racism on the part of the government, but also an example of the way in which communities became very unequal. It created a very unbalanced playing field. So we always talk to young people about the ways, oh, America's the land of opportunity and these kind of things. But we don't talk about the ways in which opportunity was not equal, which actually can be far more empowering. Because the danger of always talking about the land of opportunity in an unqualified sense is that then if you see people like you not succeeding and you're told, well, anyone who pulls themselves up by the bootstraps is sure to succeed, you're in danger of internalizing negative self-images, of thinking, well, what did I do wrong if I didn't make it? Or if I look and there are in positions of wealth and power and that kind of thing, there are certain groups overrepresented and others underrepresented. So you can see in the post-World War II government assistance program, something like the GI Bill, after World War II, GIs received government-subsidized home mortgages, but there was no oversight to ensure that non-white minorities got their fair share. Now, home ownership is not only an indicator of social economic status, but it's also highly correlated with other benefits like education and healthcare and that kind of thing. And to give you an example of how this plays out, home ownership also determines investment patterns in certain communities. Those investment patterns are directly tied to other social benefits that have to do with the quality of neighborhoods, how good the schools are, and stuff like that. So you'll see a situation where you can look at different cities across the country that were boom towns during World War II because of the economic, the military-industrial complex, right? They were very diverse, working people. Once the jobs in the military industries left some of those towns, a lot of the GIs were able, with the GI Bill, to move out to the suburbs. But unfortunately, this was predominantly the white GIs that were able to move to the suburbs, contributing to a phenomenon that's called in American history white flight, suburban white flight in the 1950s. But what you see then is the development of the core within the inner city, lack of investment patterns. So you cannot blame the victim. You cannot look to those communities and look for what's wrong without first examining not only racially restrictive zoning laws around housing, but also the investment patterns, the funding. It boils down to these economic incentives on the part of the government and the way in which investment patterns are tied to those economic incentives. With home loans, just to give you one quick example, this totally determines the quality of education in certain communities because educational funding is tied to local property taxes. So when you're able to move out and invest in a home with a government-subsidized mortgage, not only does that free up cash to send your kids to college and do other things, but it also determines the quality of your elementary, middle, and high schools. Only about 7% of school funding comes from the federal government, and the rest of it comes from local property taxes. So if your home is worth more, there's more funding going into your schools. And we ended up with this incredibly unequal schooling throughout most of the 20th century in the United States, and arguably still today with the achievement gap and other issues around schooling. And it wasn't just segregation laws, but it was also these patterns of investment. If you look then at the next slide, you'll see these staggering statistics around just how unequal the situation was. In the post-World War II government assistance programs, for example, of the $120 billion in subsidized mortgages to servicemen provided by the GI Bill after World War II, less than 2% went to minorities before 1962. That is staggering and saddening. Another example, again on the slightly painful side, is that of 67,000 mortgages issued under the GI Bill in New York and northern New Jersey, 66,900 went to white veterans. Alongside those unequal economic patterns, you see social and psychological challenges. A lot of times we're familiar with veterans trying to transition back into society after unpopular wars and issues like that. But if you turn to the next slide, you'll see of the homeless veterans, 57% are African American or Hispanic, approximately 40% of homeless veterans have some form of mental illness. And there's clear disproportionality going on here. Because African American and Latino veterans only make up about 14% of the total veteran population. And so it's interesting that this disproportionality is almost the complete inverse of another disproportionality we saw earlier in the lesson, which was that of the casualty rate, right? There are these questions around why are Latinos dying at higher rates? So if they make up something like 8% of the Vietnam War soldiers in Vietnam, they're making up 19% of the casualties. And there's similar evidence from World War II and similar evidence from Iraq. And the question is it that they're more heroic? They're willing to put themselves in danger. They're more willing to sacrifice for their comrades and that sort of thing. Or is it that they're more likely to be put in more dangerous situations? And we'll look at that. But what I want you to think about right here is these parallel issues of disproportionality with the percentages. Okay? And if you look at the second bullet point there, it says a study conducted by the National Alliance on Mental Health found that Hispanic Vietnam veterans, especially Puerto Rican Vietnam veterans, have a higher risk for PTSD and experience more severe PTSD symptoms than non-Hispanic white Vietnam veterans. Again, what do you do with statistics like that? You start to think through logically what some of the causes of these things might be. So what are the social pressures of discrimination? What are the social stresses that you might have to face as a Latino war veteran that other veterans might not face? How does that add to other issues, the normal issues that all veterans deal with? Then the last slide will end on a brighter note with the economic returns on military service. It hasn't all been bright and sunny. You see some studies show this decline on the returns on investment for military service. But what I want to call your attention to is that statistic right there that shows that veterans from non-white minorities have taken greater advantage of the military's educational benefits in recent years than whites. And that's great news because there are benefits, and the question is, are they given equally, and are they taken advantage of equally? And it seems at least that this is signs of success. That concludes our presentation on Latinos in World War II. Thank you so much for your attention, and have a great time discussing these really important issues.